Good evening. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we meet and we learn from each other tonight on country. I'm coming to you from Gadigal land, where I live, work and write, and I pay my sincere respects to elders past, present and emerging, and I extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are with us here this evening. Welcome to another edition of History Matters. Tonight it's Queer History. History Matters is on the first Wednesday of every month and is a collaboration between the State Library of New South Wales and our partners Professional Historians Association of New South Wales and ACT and the Oral History Association. If you have any questions this evening for our panellists, please use the chat feature on Zoom and our host Scott McKinnon will read your questions after both speakers have given their talks this evening. Scott will be known to many of you. He's the Vice President of Oral History New South Wales. He's also the leader of the Pride History Group, and many of you will know him through his recent book, available through Intellect Books, Gay Men at the Movies. He's also one of the library's fellows. We always love having a library fellow at these events. We have two this evening, both of them are Keesing Fellows, and Scott is the 2021 Keesing Fellow, and it's been great having him in the library a lot this year. Please welcome Scott. Thanks, Scott.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and good evening and welcome to everyone. Thank you for joining us this evening. I'll begin by acknowledging that I tonight am on unceded Gamilaroi land and pay my respects to elders past and present. And tonight we have two great speakers talking on the topic of queer history, both coming up at that topic from slightly different directions, but both with a connection to the State Library of New South Wales. We have the creator of a current exhibition on gay history at the State Library of New South Wales, and we have a historian who has been working on a Nancy Keesing Fellowship through 2020. So I'll begin by introducing Ronald Briggs. Ronald Briggs is a Gamilaroi man. He's a curator and librarian at the State Library of New South Wales, and he's originally from Moree in country New South Wales. He's helped research and create the library's exhibition Coming Out in the 70s with his colleagues Margot Riley and Bruce Carter. Ronald is a gay Indigenous man living in Sydney and has extensive experience working with the library's Aboriginal collections, and he's previously worked with AIATSIS in Canberra. I'll hand it over to you, Ronald.
Great. Thanks, Scott, and good evening to everyone at home or at work or wherever you are. I would also like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of Sydney, who's where I'm giving this talk from, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. I'd also like to thank the Professional Historians Association New South Wales and ACT and Oral History New South Wales for this opportunity to talk a little bit about the exhibition a fabulous exhibition that we currently have on here at the State Library of New South Wales called Coming Out in the 70s. It was launched in November last year. It has been really popular with audiences that come along to see it. Before I begin though, I'll just give a really big shout out to my colleague Margot Riley, who really was the lead curator for this exhibition, and her enthusiasm and energy helped to drive it and make it such, what a wonderful, what I would say wonderful exhibition that we have on site now. And just to let you know, even though it's a library-driven exhibition and it features, and most prominently, material from the library's collections, of course, we actually had a wonderful team of first-hand accounts, witnesses, helping us with it and guiding us through some of the main themes and issues that we've featured in the exhibition. So I'll just give a quick hello to Robert French, Gary Wotherspoon, Sue Wills, Seymour Hardy, Robin Kennedy, Johnny Allen and Pam Hain, who were all keen for us to get this exhibition up and running, and we value their input highly. So thank you to them for that. The idea for this exhibition actually came about in about 2015, 2016, when we were thinking about acknowledging or celebrating the 50-year anniversary of a gay organisation in Sydney called CAMP, which stood for the Campaign Against Moral Persecution. That was certainly the first gay organisation established in New South Wales. There were some earlier in other parts of the country, but CAMP was probably the most effective and earliest gay organisation operating from Sydney. In fact, the exhibition features all 39 editions of their journal called Camp Inc. So our feature wall of the exhibition has every single edition of Camp Inc. for people to have a look at. And if you go online, you can actually read the entire magazine as well. Camp Inc. began in 1971 and closed in 1977, but the library is thrilled to have had all of the issues available for the public to have a look at. But when we started delving more into how we might celebrate camp, it became clear that it was a much bigger story to tell. And certainly items from the library's collection helped to tell really good stories about gay people, gay community and gay life and gay organisations in Sydney from the 1970s. So we decided to expand out from just camp to include more of what was happening in Sydney at the time. We wanted to avoid a timeline approach, going through month by month, by year by year by year. Instead, we took a more thematic way of doing it, and we've decided that we'd break it into three main sections, if you like. I mean, if you come in and have a look at it, it's fairly clear that we're telling stories, but within different thematic ways. The main theme, one of the main themes that we decided was about being seen, because with camp and a lot of other gay and lesbian organisations that sprouted during this time, one of their main aims was to increase visibility, to let the general public know that we're here, we're queer, get used to it, basically. So a big part of the exhibition looks at all the ways in which gay people were making themselves known to the wider community. We look particularly at attempts to increase our gay presence in Australian media, in the mainstream media. We're featuring a groundbreaking edition of the Australian newspaper, which on the 19th of September 1970 featured an article with the organisation Camp's founders, Christabel Pole and John Ware. And this was the first article in Australia to be published that featured out proud gay people. Before that, 19th of December 1970, you weren't able to read articles, positive articles, telling the stories of out proud gay men and women. We've included it, and actually we've included the draft article, the typescript article that was written by Gary Wotherspoon. Gary Wotherspoon attended the very first camp meeting in Glebe in Sydney in 1970, and decided to write an article about what the meeting was about, who was there and what they hoped to achieve. And he sent the draft of that article to the Bulletin newspaper to publish. So we've got Gary's letter that he wrote, and it was published. So we've got Gary's letter that he wrote to the Bulletin with all the little editing marks throughout it. But there's a nice note at the bottom of the letter that Gary sent that said, "Please do not identify me as the author." Gary was fearful that he could be sacked from his job at Sydney University if it became known that he was a homosexual. We've also included some of the more raunchy, sexy underground type publications that were sprouting up in Sydney at the time, but people did read them for the articles. There were actually some very good articles in them written by some of the main proponents for gay rights at the time and exploring some of the issues. I mean, interspersed with pictures of nude, naked men and whatever, but I'm sure that some people did get them to read the articles. We've got a nice selection of those for people to have a look at. Not the kids. I mean, we haven't exposed anything too untoward. I mean, younger people can come in. They won't, they won't be shocked. We also looked at how gay people were being mainstreamed through television, and we've featured. We've got some articles featuring the show called Number 96, which had the first gay male character on television, Don Finlayson, and that brings back a lot of nostalgia for people that visit, who can remember the time. Another main theme that we looked at was being heard, which is more about the activist side of the movement in Sydney, and in some other places like Newcastle, but primarily Sydney. So the library has a wonderful photographic collection recording many of the demonstrations that were happening in Sydney, with people openly expressing their sexuality, gay and proud, homosexuals rule, and a wonderful selection of badges that have been donated to the library. We had more than 300 badges donated from the 70s, that show people's attitudes at the time around gay men and women. Another theme, we also look at a growing political movement that was happening. There were a few gay men who ran for election. We've featured them a little bit as well. And another theme that we explore in Coming Out in the 70s is the theme of being yourself, which, and from many of the interviews and many of the recollections and records that we ploughed through from the library's collections, that there was you always get, from the individual accounts, you always get the sense that by participating in gay society, people learned to realise that they weren't alone and that they had some power. And then the ways that we were being discriminated against could be changed. And that's a real sense of pride in what they were doing. Our advisory group also reminded us that although, it was deadly serious and dangerous and tricky environment to work within, that it was also fun. There was lots of parties and gatherings and societies and venues that people could gather. So we're keen to show that although it was a dangerous time for many gay people, it was also a time of fun. This is the 70s we're talking about. And it's reflected in a lot of the posters that we have on display. Poster art from the time is just brilliant, and we've tried to include as many of the original posters from the time as we could in the exhibition, given that we did have limited space though. And we delve into a bit of this, the social scene in Sydney from the time, as well as looking at the lead up to the first Mardi Gras in 78. Putting Coming Out in the 70s together was challenging, especially during the time of COVID. It meant that we didn't always have ready access to the material that we wanted to use. We did manage to meet with our advisors face to face, or all socially distanced and all that, of course. When writing about and captioning and telling the stories from Coming Out in the 70s, we were a bit challenged by using the word homosexual all the time, because that's how gay people described themselves in the early 70s, at least, was as homosexuals. And for a modern audience, using the word homosexual, it wasn't quite the right way to go. So we prefer using gay men and lesbians, and at that stage, at that time, and quite frankly, we don't have a lot of records or information about other parts of the community, such as bisexual and transgender people. So for some people that was confronting that we weren't including them in our descriptions of the material, but we were just reflecting what was being used at the time and what our advisory group was recommending that we use. What was also, I guess not shocking, but was also difficult was that we didn't have a diversity of voices from the library's collection. There is virtually no Indigenous content that I could find, at least, from the library's gay and lesbian collections that talk about Aboriginal people's experiences, and also multicultural people's experiences as well from the 70s. But that was not good, but it was interesting for us because it helped build our idea for a collection drive, which basically means getting more material into the library that relates to gay and lesbian community, LGBTI community, into the collection that does reflect a more inclusive inclusive experiences. So part of the coming out in the 70s exhibition and ongoing will be a drive where we're trying to address getting more voices, diverse voices, into the library's collection. But the drive has been quite good so far. We're getting lots of response from people out in the community who want to share their information and their collections with the rest of the state, or the rest of the world really, by depositing them with the library. For example, we've had more than 400 posters and badges donated to the library, building on the library's poster collection, but building on, as I was talking about earlier, that wonderful poster art from the period that's been documented. We've received Lex Watson's personal papers, which is really lovely, and they complement his collection that was donated a few years ago about gay organisations that operated in Sydney from the 60s up to about the time of his death, really. We've got a lovely collection of diaries from a wonderful man named John Englert, and we feature them in the exhibition and on our website as well. But his teenage diaries are just wonderful, and he talks, one particular entry has him saying that he, as a 17-year-old, he went to a gay rights march and he came out. It was a pivotal moment, and just a lovely read from a young gentleman who was 17 at the time. You know, now he's still around and living in Melbourne, but a lovely little. We also have Sally Colchin's photo negative archive documenting lesbian community and experiences from the 70s, which is absolutely fantastic and a pivotal collection, I think, for the library to have to document the lesbian experience. It's really fantastic. And Scott would know, we've also done a few oral history recordings, one with Gary Wotherspoon, a couple, and one with Sue Willis, and we have more in train, so we'll have a wonderful oral history collection, building on the existing oral history collection that the State Library already has relating to gay people. I'll just finish up by saying that the exhibition will close in 3 weeks on the 30th of May. So if you get a chance to come into the library and have a good look at it. But it's also, we also have a wonderful online version of the exhibition as well. I'm just going to quickly share the screen now to show you what that looks like. So if you go to the library's website, it's fairly prominently displayed, coming out in the 70s, and a lot of the information. What's great about the web presence is that we can include a lot more information that wasn't actually included in the exhibition. So I encourage you to go through and have a look at our online version as well. I've just got to get back to stop share. So yes, so I encourage you to come in and have a look at the exhibition. Think about any collection or any material you might have that relates to the gay and lesbian experience in New South Wales, and consider approaching the library about making it available or donating or whatever for the library's collection. And it's actually a little exhibition that will build up to a huge bigger exhibition that's happening in 2023, because if, as you may already know, in 2023, Sydney will be hosting International Pride, which will encourage visitors from all over the world and nationally, of course, into Sydney in 2023. And that's when the library is planning to do this wonderful, still in the planning stages, of course, but still a wonderful, big, beautiful, fabulous exhibition for Pride in Sydney in 2023. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks so much, Ronald. That was great. So great to get an overview of the exhibition, and I really encourage everyone to if you can, get into the library and have a look. It's well worth your time, and if not, there's that great web presence for the exhibition as well. Now, if you have any questions for Ronald, I encourage you to put them in the chat or the Q&A section of Zoom. Type them in there and I will read them out when we have a Q&A section after our next presentation. So start popping them in there now. That'd be wonderful. So to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Sophie Robinson is a historian of Australian lesbian communities and a member of Pride History Group. She was the State Library of New South Wales Nancy Keesing Fellow for 2020, and her research centred on the archives and legacies of Wicked Women and LOTL, 2 magazines, and the overall development of Sydney's lesbian communities during the 1990s. So I'll hand it over to you, Sophie.
Thanks very much, Scott, and hi everyone that's tuning in this evening. Thanks for being here on a Wednesday night. I'm speaking tonight on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I'd like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It is great to be here on any night of the week, but tonight to speak about queer histories. Thanks to the State Library of New South Wales, Professional Historians New South Wales and ACT and Oral History New South Wales for collaborating and organising tonight's discussion. And thanks also to previous speaker Ronald for talking through the process of putting together what is a really amazing exhibition of Australia's queer history. I attended this exhibition, and friends of mine and members of my community attended this exhibition, and it's really incredible just the amount of work that went into putting together so many different themes and aspects of what is a really dynamic history of gay, lesbian, queer life in Australia. So as Scott introduced, I'm a historian who has been closely focused on researching the development of lesbian politics, activism and communities in Australia since the emergence of the key sexual liberation movements of the early 1970s, so namely Campaign Against Moral Persecution, or CAMP, the Women's Liberation Movement and Gay Liberation. Lesbians and queer women were key participants in these movements, and from within them they developed a really distinct lesbian feminist politics and culture in Australia, both connected to but also separate to these broader movements. And this politics and this culture of lesbian feminism flourished, diversified and shifted on into the 1980s and 1990s and is still evolving to this day. And this is my sort of general area of interest, understanding and documenting the lesbian presence in Australia's queer history. So early last year, I commenced the Nancy Keesing Fellowship at the State Library of New South Wales, which Scott McKinnon is the recipient of this year. And my project proposal was to focus on the State Library's collection of 2 key publications that came out of the lesbian and queer women's scene in Sydney from the late 1980s and early 1990s. And these were Wicked Women magazine, so Australia's first lesbian sex radical publication that included articles, photography, experimental prose, poetry, personal ads, and so much more, all celebrating a diverse lesbian sexuality. Also, Lesbians on the Loose, or LOTL as it's more commonly known, which was Australia's first free lesbian magazine fully reliant on advertising that aimed to be a voice for lesbians around Australia. Both Wicked Women and LOTL were published and based out of Sydney, but their reach was expansive across Australia. Tracing LOTL's history, which first began with editors Frances Rann and Jazz Ishtar in 1990, and then Frances Rann and Barbara Farrelly, who Farrelly was also the first female editor of the Sydney Star Observer, we can see so much evidence of a really expanding and confident lesbian presence in the gay commercial and cultural scene of Sydney and broader Australia at this time. Through all the diverse articles, events, lifestyle politics, writing and creativity represented in the pages of LOTL by and for lesbians and an increasingly queer identified female readership. Wicked Women, which emerged earlier in 1988, started by Jasper Labert and Talisa Salmon, who were wanting to connect with more people in the lesbian and queer scenes that were interested in BDSM and kink subcultures in particular, also reflected this really diverse cultural scene amongst lesbians and queer women. But their work, their efforts with Wicked Women were also highlighting a really specific sexual revolution going on in Sydney at this time amongst lesbians and queer women. More and more lesbians and queer activists like Jasper and Talisa were creating spaces and resources in the 90s to expand possibilities for living a lesbian life that was both sexual and political. And Wicked Women was a really big part of that. Political activism and feminist networks had really defined Sydney's lesbian community since the 1970s and into the 1980s. And in many ways, the confidence gained from these years were propelling lesbians by the 1990s to locate other ways of empowering themselves as lesbians, as women, and they were pioneering new resources and spaces for sexual health activism, erotica and performance art, publishing, and many more forms of activism to continue what was already a very strong feminist agenda of enhancing lesbian visibility. Out of the Wicked Women magazines came the Miss Wicked contests and parties that were designed to financially support and went in tandem with Wicked Women magazine. And they also became their own cultural sensation in Sydney in the 1990s and were a really important space for the sex radical lesbian community and the emerging queer and trans scenes to express themselves and foster collective solidarity. The presence of Wicked Women, however, was quite controversial for the lesbian community in Sydney at this time. And indeed, by the early 1990s, there were a lot of events and publications, articles and public debates in the pages of LOTL, in Wicked Women and other forums, where these questions about the links between power, desire, lesbian sexuality were really raging amongst lesbian and feminist communities. Though these weren't at all new issues or new debates, but they were particularly strong in the 90s around these scenes. LOTL and Wicked Women were both covering and leading these debates in their own ways in the 1990s, referencing each other, talking to each other, and these communities were very much intertwined. So for instance, in the fifth anniversary issue of LOTL in 1995, one article highlighted that the hottest debate of those first 5 years of the magazine had in fact been the greater visibility of sex radical lesbian communities in Sydney and the arrival of Wicked Women magazine. And LOTL's second issue back in 1990 had also advertised the upcoming Miss Wicked contest, where participants were encouraged to perform their most wicked sexual fantasy or identity. And a later issue of LOTL pictured the crowned winner Sky, as well as other lesbian sex and play party events. And they definitely received both applause and criticism from readers for this coverage. Another piece in the same issue of LOTL in 1990 defended this new lesbian sex radical content pouring out of the lesbian scene, not just within LOTL and Wicked Women, it was noticeable elsewhere. And this article argued that it was actually a really positive sign of a developing lesbian gaze and, quote, was creating a space in the visual language where we can have a gaze, a choice and express ourselves as lesbians. So in choosing to look at these two publications, Wicked Women and LOTL, in tandem, I wanted to do a couple of things. Firstly, I highlight what I've come to know through a lot of oral histories and other archival research, that the 1980s and 1990s was a really thriving, politically driven and often really sexually adventurous lesbian scene developing in Sydney. And this is a narrative that is often lost or not fully explored in Sydney queer histories. I also wanted to show that Australian lesbian communities, especially in Sydney, have never been monolithic, and particularly during the 1990s, as lesbian activism, as feminist activism was expanding into a range of areas, including sexual health activism, sex radicalism, anti-violence activism, and much more. Another big motivation to do this research was also to explore and highlight the State Library's important collection of queer archives, which are quite expansive, but not always obvious to people unfamiliar with the collection or even library catalogues and research processes. I know this is something that the library is looking to shift through creating accessible research guides for those conducting studies and projects of research into Australian queer histories in particular. What has also been really amazing in this project was that in addition to accessing the past issues of these magazines themselves within the library's collection, I was also accessing an extensive personal archive deposited to the State Library by Frances Rand, including correspondence, business records, photographs, letters, newsletters, cuttings, articles, advertising, booklets, conference and festival information, so much ephemera. And delving through all this material that Frances had kept, all the specific pieces of paper, marginalia, ephemera, drafts, notes, on the copy, on all the things in preparation for each issue, I was really struck by the immense effort and intention required of Frances, who from 1993 was working largely from home full-time on this publication, and of course with Barbara Farrelly, as they attended to the immense copy that came their way, the advertisements, the personals and classifieds, as well as the political reports, submissions from groups such as the Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby, informing LOTL editors of sort of current issues with civil rights and human rights abuses against lesbians and queer people, opinion pieces, and all the correspondence they received. And in comparing and contrasting all of this with actual issues of LOTL, I could see that I could see their real dedication to covering everything and ensuring people's stories and people's input got in. They had such a big role in trying to represent this hugely diverse community. What I also found within these personal papers were many signs and paper trails of this broader phenomenon happening in the lesbian community at the time in the 1990s, as it was expanding its sexual and identity politics. There were signs, for instance, of the ongoing sex debates, questions about the links between feminism and lesbianism, and also more on the ground, grassroots interpersonal dialogues and conversations between members of the queer community, some quite difficult, centering on issues such as lateral violence, microaggressions, abuse and conflict within the community, reflections on the difficult and really intense work of activism, on developing lesbian community in the face of ongoing discrimination, homophobia and sexism, the longing to create new forms of family and kinship without the structures and laws that currently exist today to support these endeavours for lesbians and queer people. And all of this was being communicated to LOTL editors to go in issues of the magazine. I also noted, trawling through the handwritten classifieds and personal ads, this deep reliance on magazines like LOTL and Wicked Women to act as communicators and mediums for building community, for locating lovers, friendships, even things like trying to find band members for all women's bands or women to join BDSM groups and rural land projects. There were some particularly favourite personals and classifieds that I came across in these archives, scrolling through all the folders, especially in this sort of age of online apps and online forums. one handwritten note that was someone asked to have published in the classified section said, "Woman with a van, available for light removals and safe rides home." Another said, "Intelligent, caring lesbian, 31, seeks a kindred spirit, professional woman with interests in riding, cycling, permaculture, bushwalking and conservation, would like to make new friendships." Another advertised a lesbian plumber, a lesbian mechanic, and another was looking for a sperm donor for her and her partner. So going forward, my aim is to continue trawling through these folders of ephemera and think about the ways in which LOTL tried to represent unsuccessfully and sometimes successfully this diverse lesbian community, and similarly with Wicked Women, what it was doing and how it was representing diverse sexual and political interests of the lesbian and queer community. I'm also wanting to ensure that more cultural histories of lesbian Sydney and lesbian politics and activism in Australia are written, recorded and shared, and that libraries as well as community archives such as AQA in Melbourne and Pride History Group in Sydney, which Scott and I are both a part of, continue to both be crucial sites in which queer collections are housed for future generations of researchers. There's definitely lots more to say about the 1990s as well, which were a critical time in expanding lesbian visibility in cultural and commercial areas in Sydney, including in areas of leadership, such as Mardi Gras with the election of President Kath Phillips, and other leadership roles held by lesbians in the gay and lesbian rights lobby at this time, the gay and lesbian counselling service, and in bars and businesses generally, as DJs, event promoters and more. Lesbians were really leading and shifting the cultural scene in Sydney at this time in the 90s, and I really want more histories to reflect that. Oral histories with key figures are another important part of this project to come, and the amount of conversations I've had with people about these magazines, their role in their life, how they were read, consumed and engaged with is a huge part of this story and something I'm looking forward to tracing and sharing more of. Thanks very much for listening.
Thanks, Sophie, for a great presentation. It's such an exciting topic that you're exploring there, and can just feel your enthusiasm for it. It's just great, and a great big well done to the State Library of New South Wales for supporting such a fantastic project. Ronald, if you want to pop your camera back on again as well, and we've got some questions have come in for Ronald, but if you have any for Sophie or any that for either of the presenters, start popping those into the chat now. But to start, I've got a question here for you, Ronald. Somebody's wondering what is contained in the collection, in the Lex Watson collection that the library has recently acquired.
Oh, okay, yeah. Great. Well, it's in two parts. The first part is, I guess, documents Lex's involvement with gay organisations in Sydney, as well as a lot of material relating to AIDS and the AIDS epidemic. And then the collection that we receive later are more of Lex's personal papers, more like his diaries and letters and his wonderful poster collection as well. We haven't done a full listing yet for it's cataloguing in process for Lex's papers, because it is such a wonderful but massive collection that we do want to give it, do it some justice. Sophie talked a little about how sometimes catalogue records can be deceiving or leave things out, or just not really reflect the work of the person who created them. So we want to do it properly in the first time when we're cataloguing Lex's material. But if you wanted to contact me later, I can send you a list of what we have already processed. So yeah, but it's if you know of Lex and of his work, he was just stellar in the community, in what he was able to achieve. A real hero, I guess. So just send through an email and I'll send you through a list of what we've done already.
Yeah, yes, I'm sure it's a massive collection, and I know that Robert French has put a lot of work into working through those records and getting them ready for the library. So a little nod to Robert.
Wonderful work, yeah.
Yeah. A question for you, Sophie. Someone wants to hear more about what the Miss Wicked events in the 1990s were.
Okay. Well, it's a great question. They were pretty amazing events. So they were contests in which participants were invited to come up and perform a kind of sexual fantasy or sort of their most wicked identity or expression of self. And often this was a space in which lesbians and queer people and a range of people, these performances and contests invited a spectrum of gender and sexualities to perform and take part, and to really just, I guess, challenge some ideas about lesbian sexuality, about queer sexuality, and to feel kind of empowered and confident in their bodies and in their expression. These were often sort of underground events at warehouses. There was, I think, a lot of leather involved, a lot of kind of BDSM subculture, aesthetics. They were pretty amazing and cool events from anecdotes and oral histories I've conducted with people that attended or performed. They were pretty out there and confronting because they were kind of the first of their kind to be doing this sort of thing. I think they also just aim to be quite inclusive spaces as well, and safe spaces for the performers. And I think a lot of the people that performed have kind of become legendary within the lesbian scene, and still are sort of known for really leading the way with some really avant-garde, sex radical performances and performance art at that time. So I definitely invite you to look through the archives of Wicked Women at the State Library, or places like Aqua, where there's copies of them, and they've got kind of full spreads and pictures from these events and pictures of the winners. It was just such a cultural sensation, I think, at that time. And yeah, it's very, very interesting.
Thanks, Sophie. So Ronald, a question and comment here. There's a thanks for the wonderful presentation supporting the exhibition coming out in the 70s. This person's just checked out the online version and it looks fantastic, and they're wondering how long it will be accessible for and whether it has the same lifespan of the exhibition or whether it will continue online.
Oh, no, that's the great thing about having an online version, is that it's pretty much permanent. The exhibition will come down in 3 weeks, it'll just disappear, poof. And but the web presence will remain, for as long as think forever. I can't foresee us taking it down. In fact, we have an archive page called Past Exhibitions, where you can go back to I think to the 1980s and see exhibitions that we've had an online version of anyway.
Great. A suggestion for you, I think, here. Someone letting you know that Vivian Walker's papers are with the Walker Family's archive at the University of Queensland.
Yes.
And that Vivian reported organising a picket of Capriccios, which was a gay nightclub in 1969-70, which would be an early Indigenous action. Is that something you...
Great. Yeah, that's good to know. Yeah, of course we were focusing a bit on New South Wales, but that is really good to know because with the World Pride coming up in 2023, it's something that we can investigate. Thanks for letting us know. Yeah, definitely, Vivian Walker. Yep.
Yeah, and
right.
when you were talking about the kind of challenges of trying to represent diversity in an exhibition like this, are there ways that you can kind of acknowledge the absences in the archive when you're putting together an exhibition?
Yeah, you can in the guide, and I think we have mentioned that in the online version that that we recognise that there are gaps, and that we're endeavouring to to fill as much as we can those gaps, and get more inclusive voices in the collection. I mean, I wasn't surprised simply because there's not a lot of not a lot of Aboriginal voices anyway going back before the 70s. So yeah, it's something that we're always mindful. Well, I'm always mindful of, and want the library to get better at it.
Great, yeah. Sophie, another question for you. Thanks, Sophie. Your examples of chasing a paper trail in the LOTL Wicked Women collections was brilliant. Can you talk more about the process? For example, work, surprise, joy, frustration of discovery in the archive.
Sure. Well, I think anyone that deals with archives, historical archives, and especially queer and feminist archives, there's so much kind of material and so much kind of searching through paper trails and accumulating and creating your archive and putting it all together, and it can feel quite frenetic at times. And I think there's definitely moments of feeling a bit of chaos and a bit of frustration in trying to sort of make sense of what is quite a big archive and a big project, and sort of working with existing publications and then sort of piecing that together with the building blocks and paper and notes and ephemera of the personal collection as well, particularly with LOTL. But there's just so much joy with sitting with actual physical materials as a historian of the past, and actually sitting with the kind of the things that were critical to putting together the publication and critical to the sort of thoughts and ideas that went into creating magazines like LOTL at that time, and looking at the notes made by Frances and the kind of the work that went into deciding what would make it to an issue, and all the kind of information the editors were receiving, and just the sheer effort that went into trying to represent a community, such a diverse sexual and political community. There's just, it's kind of awe-inspiring. And I remember sitting at the State Library with the boxes of ephemera and physical materials, and sort of having it all laid out there. And I think I had a report from the Gay and Lesbian Rights Lobby, a business card of the lesbian leather and sadomasochism shop, Per Effect, that was owned by Gigi and Andrea. And then I had some a lesbian personal ad from a woman looking for a sperm donor. And I just had this kind of triangle of the lesbian scene in front of me, which, you know, are still reflective of lesbian cultural and political interests today, and just had so much sort of joy in seeing the history of my community in front of me, and thinking about the ways that the editors of this magazine were also trying to sort through that at that time and put it all together. So I think the answer is just there's a lot of chaos and a lot of frenetic energy with doing archival research, but you have moments of real indescribable joy at piecing together the history.
That's wonderful. Ronald, did you have similar experiences searching through the collection for this exhibition?
Oh, yes. Yes, there were collections that we hadn't really looked at before that were just full of, you know, wonderful information. The records of the first 20 years of the women's movement in New South Wales is a wonderful collection. It's and it really needs to be looked at and read, you know, given a more detailed catalogue record, because there's just so much wonderful lesbian information within that collection that we, you know, more people should be aware of. But I think, like Sophie, we were lucky in that it's quite recent. It's quite recent times that we're looking at. I mean, the 1970s for some people isn't recent, but recent, and Sophie's area looking at the 80s and 90s is recent. So oftentimes you can actually call the person or contact the person, you know, that's, you know, mentioned in the papers, and ask them, you know, what's this about and what did you do? So I think we were lucky with coming out in the 70s that we could actually talk to the people that were, you know, being photographed and shown in the records, which is good. Although it gives you the problem, you know, gives you problems later on when you're looking at copyright and and all that fun stuff. But no, but it was good. It was good being able to contact the people that were being talked about and pictured in those collections.
Yeah, great. So we've still got 10 minutes for questions. So if people have more, pop them in the chat. That would be wonderful. I've got probably very big question for Sophie. I'm trying to, thinking about you looking at the Coming Out in the 70s exhibition. Can you see a path from what you're looking at in that exhibition to the work that you're doing on the 90s and the lesbian scene there? Like what had remained, what had changed?
Well, I guess LOTL and Wicked Women, they're preceded by a long history and continuous history of lesbian periodicals and publications and grassroots publishing amongst lesbians and queer women out of the women's movement. So this is like a continuation. So I think I'm tracing this kind of these ongoing efforts within lesbian and queer communities broadly to make sure that they represent themselves, that they have something to communicate with each other, and that's something that is distinct, that can reflect their culture. So I'm seeing a continuation of that, continued kind of effort to enhance lesbian visibility and culture and celebrate lesbian sexuality, challenge stereotypes and myths, and create spaces in which lesbians can be proud about who they are. That is very much a big kind of connection between what we see is happening in the 70s and all the kind of things reflected in the exhibition. The Coming Out exhibition is this kind of expanding, growing consciousness of lesbians and queer women aware of oppression, wanting to fight it and wanting to create new futures for themselves in which they can be out and proud. And I think we have the legacies of that with LOTL and Wicked Women and the people involved in that. They are, writing those sort of successes of the women's movement and of lesbian feminism and of merging sort of queer and trans activism, and it's kind of all coming together and being reflected in LOTL and Wicked Women. And I think a lot of the people involved were also just, political themselves in different ways and had been involved in activism. And these weren't kind of necessarily distinct generations or distinct groups of lesbians. They're all kind of connected by the same history, but yeah, I guess there are also some definite shifts too. There are sort of younger generations of lesbians coming through with different kind of awareness around identity and politics, but definitely so many connections that I'm seeing between the politics and activism and culture of lesbians.
Yeah, great. And we've just got another question for Sophie. Any observations on identity politics versus queer during that period?
I think certainly in the 90s there's more kind of queer identifying groups and more kind of discussion and celebration of queer as a sort of broad identity label and experience of gender and sexuality in this time. And I think that was a tension with perhaps sort of lesbian identity politics, and perhaps still is, but I think we see lesbian spaces being real kind of vanguard spaces and front runners for celebrating a queerness and a queer sexuality and queer identity. And we see that with Wicked Women. This is a publication celebrating lesbian sexuality, but it's very much a kind of queer presence and a kind of queer sex radicalism guiding that. And so kind of showing that the two can go together. So I think that's definitely something I'm noticing.
Thanks for that. Ronald, I'm wondering about, you mentioned oral history as part of the exhibition. I'm wondering about even the practicalities of including oral history in an exhibition like Coming Out in the 70s. How do you include it? Probably easier in the online version, but in the space of an exhibition?
Yeah, well, generally with exhibitions, to include an oral history is not a good idea simply because of the length, and people coming to an exhibition don't want to stand for 45 minutes and listen to someone's life story. When we do include oral histories in any exhibition, it's usually an excerpt with a transcript that people can listen to quickly and easily and read as well. But there's always, we always encourage people, we give them the location number, for example, and and encourage people to listen to the full version in the reading rooms if they can, or make a request and have it sent to you digitally.
Okay, and there's another question for you here. Could you talk more about the material? Was it a diary? I think it was a diary that you mentioned. John Eldridge?
John Englert. Yeah,
Englert, sorry.
Yeah, he's still quite the activist and living down in Melbourne, but he donated his diaries from when he was a kid or teenager and into adulthood, his first years of university. Just his handwritten daily observations and notes and recollections, some drawings and quite a good little photographic collection as well that came along with it. But just a lovely story of him coming to terms with his sexuality and finally attending a gay rights protest in Martin Place and admitting in his diary, and I have come out. And it was just like a eureka moment for him, and a lovely story. I mean, you know, you could make a nice little doco or movie about it, I think.
Yeah, great. The question here is wondering if there's an oral history follow-up with whether you're going to do an oral history with him.
We would love to. Would love to, and it's on the cards. My colleague Bruce Carter, who's the curator of coming out in the 70s as well, has approached a number of people that have been involved with this exhibition for oral histories that we're pursuing over the next year or so.
And you mentioned, Sophie, you're doing oral histories as well as part of this research.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's going to be an important contribution to, you know, making these histories of the magazines come alive and learning about how people engage with them, and the countless people that, you know, would go and pick up LOTL, and that would be kind of their like journey through the streets of Newtown and their kind of experience of the scene, or similarly with Wicked Women and going to the events. It's important to hear these stories firsthand.
It's such an interesting connection between the physical magazine and the spaces of lesbian Sydney, and the kind of connections, people discovering a physical space through that magazine. You've talked about the kind of life of the lesbian scene. I've seen you talk about that elsewhere. How did that kind of connect to the magazines that you're looking at?
Yeah, well, I think definitely LOTL, the kind of location points and pickup points has kind of is a big part of how the sort of scene was constructed, especially sort of in the inner west of Sydney. Certain spaces that I think through like a couple of decades continued to be prominent spots where you could pick one up. I'm pretty sure I remember my first time walking past a chemist in Newtown and picking up my first LOTL, and it was a big moment and a big kind of marking of my place in the scene, and was for many people. Wicked Women was, you did need to pay a small fee for Wicked Women in the beginning, that sort of small copy run, and it was available mainly in gay male sex shops. It didn't have this kind of broad place in the scene, and I think it was somewhat available at the feminist bookshop, but was still somewhat hidden amongst other sort of more prominent lesbian newsletters at the time. So it had a kind of more precarious, secret sort of presence in the scene, but that was kind of part of its, I guess, mystery, and now part of its history as well. So yeah, I think it's really interesting to hear about how people actually came across these copies of the magazines, and how they read them, and how many people still have full collections of their Wicked Women. So yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah, thanks so much. Okay, so it looks like we're out of time. There's just one last comment here. Thanks for the presentation, and this person saw coming out in the 70s last week and was impressed, taken back, self-questioning about did I do enough, educated and inspired. So a big thank you from him. And thank you both for such great presentations and such a great conversation. It's, yeah, wonderful work. So thanks to both of you, and thanks for everyone for your great questions and for tuning in. I need to do a little plug here for the next History Matters, which will be on Wednesday, the 2nd of June. And the topic is going to be multilingual histories. So there'll be speakers talking about Indigenous language and the use of Indigenous language in history, and the kind of process of decentering English from our history telling. as well as an audio producer talking about using oral histories in different languages in audio recordings. So it should be a great conversation that'll be chaired by the President of Oral History New South Wales, Moree. So I hope you can all join us then. But for now, thank you all. Thanks, Sophie and Ronald again.
Thanks, Ronald.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.